Special thanks to WaterStone for sponsoring Socrates in the Studio Season 3.
There seems little question that what you're describing is at the heart of the decline of the West, because the academy is always in the forefront of things that decades later kind of trickle down in other ways.
So the peer-reviewed academic literature, for good or for ill, represents that which our society at the highest level of this activity authenticates as what will act as though is true. So, for example, should some issue go to court, the judge is going to bring in, he's a judge, he's busy doing law things, right? So say it's a medical issue about transition or something. What are they going to do? They're going to bring in expert witnesses who are going to report on what the academic literature says. And so some person is going to get hired by, the attorneys, and is going to come in and say, well, there's all these papers that say that if you put things somewhere, then, you can, whatever. So we use this as the authenticating piece of what is true in our society. Now, as for the theme of the decline of the West, if the centerpiece of how you decide what is and is not going to be regarded as true is this corrupt, there will be decline. This is inevitable. The rot is so in such a dangerous place, in such a significant place, that the only really real metaphor to it is that there's the well that everyone will now drink from has a dead body in it. And it's only a matter of time till everybody's sick and dying as a result.
Hey there, folks. Welcome to Socrates in the Studio, which is under the aegis or rubric, if you will, of Socrates in the City. The city in this case being London, England. We are, for this season of Socrates in the Studio, talking about the larger question, what is the future of the West? Today, with my guest, Dr. James Lindsay, we may ask the question, or we may be talking about whether the West is in decline. In any event, who, some of you are asking, is Dr. James Lindsay. Let me tell you, Dr. James Lindsay is the best-selling author of many books, among them Cynical Theories, The Marxification of Education, and most recent, The Queering of the American Child. He holds a PhD in mathematics, yes, from the University of Tennessee. Dr. James Lindsay, welcome to Socrates in the City.
I'm excited to be here.
I am excited to talk to you about all of this stuff. Let me start by asking you to tell the story of how you came into the popular consciousness not many years ago by writing those papers, those academic papers. I love this story. So start with that.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of people will have noticed that academia is a bit off the rails. Insane is a closer term, and I'm sure we can come up with a even more fitting adjective for how crazy they've become. Well, some friends of mine, Peter Boghossian and a woman, Helen Pluckrose, who joined in later, as Peter and I initially, noticed that the leftist academia was a bit nuts, maybe by as early as 2013 or 2014.
I mean, actually, it was way before that.
Sure, but
and when you say nuts, let's be clear. By nuts, we mean crazy. And by crazy, we mean nuts. It's hard for people outside of the academy to realize there's no hyperbole here. And so
it was difficult for us to realize, as a matter of fact. So we were looking at some of these academic papers that were coming out of fields like feminist theory and gender studies and so on. At one point, there was a paper that came out that suggested that menstrual blood needed to be considered as a social construct and how it's constructed as a tool to keep women socially in their place, nothing to do with the actual physical act of menstruation. Just insane things. There were papers about how the reason that men play football and other team sports is so that they can have kind of a homoerotic bonding ritual with other men that's socially sanctioned in male space. I mean, very crazy.
As crazy as these things sound, it's all the crazier, because I just don't want my audience to lose this, that these are being written up as academic papers and being published in peer-reviewed journals. So it's one thing for somebody to have some crazy idea. It's another thing for them to write it up as an academic paper and then to have that paper accepted for publication in a peer-reviewed journal. So that's what you were noticing.
Yeah, I mean, there were papers about the culture of squirrels and various, I mean, just absolutely, I mean, the kind of thing that now we're all discovering that USAID was funding and we're all aghast. And these things, we started to see these papers, and Peter and I are making fun of them kind of publicly. We're writing about this problem. Nobody cares. And we're being told, oh, well, you're white men. You don't have an opinion on this matter. We thought that was alarming. And so kind of one thing leads to another. And eventually this particularly egregious, insane paper, in our opinion, came out. And this paper was about the science of glaciology, the study of glaciers, and its relationship to climate change. And you think, oh, well, that's where the crazy part is. No, no, no. That was well within the realm of sanity by comparison. This was about how the science of glaciology, in order to address the problem of climate change, needed to transform itself into a feminist science. And so indigenous myth and feminist art would have to inform the people studying ice in order to not be a sexist pursuit.
All right, I just feel like we should pause
Yeah, I thought you might want a breath.
to take that in.
That's what I had to do. I spent 3 days reeling after I read this paper. Reeling, because I came from the sciences. So to see this paper about the sciences saying insane things like that, the scientists are sexist. It said, so they look at the glaciers with satellites. The glaciers are on mountains. The glaciers are, on the edge of Antarctica or whatever in the ocean. And they want to see where the edges of the glaciers are. Whether you believe in climate change narratives or not, you still want to know maybe where the edges of glaciers are. So you have to take a satellite photo of the glacier. So can you guess what word they used to describe the process of satellite photography of glaciers?
Uh,
But you're on the spot. This is a fun one.
it just feels like a patriarchal top-down kind of imposition of Western scientific norms to.
But there's a specific word, one word, pornographic.
Well, obviously.
Yes, and so
Wait. You're not kidding.
I'm not kidding.
Okay, so continue.
Not only that, but it was rendered as the God's eye view from nowhere, imagining that the satellite confers objectivity that's not present in any part of social reality, but that the scientists believe in. And thus, there's a feminist who paints pictures of glaciers, and why are we not considering her paintings as part of the study of glaciology? This is for real, Eric.
What year did you and Peter read this paper?
This paper was published in the summer of 2016 from the University of Oregon on a $500,000 National Science Foundation grant. So that's taxpayer money dedicated to the sciences to publish this garbage. And we were alarmed. And so there's a man here in London named Matt Ridley. He's a journalist, and he wrote an article about this paper and gave us a world-changing idea. He said, I still maintain that this whole paper is an elaborate academic hoax whose authors have not owned up to it yet. And the University of Oregon denied it, and the authors denied it. They got a TED Talk where they talked about all of these mythologies about glaciers. And Peter and I got on the phone and said, that's an idea.
Now, wait a minute. Just to go back here. So what was the grant? How much was the grant for?
$470-something thousand, almost $500,000.
Okay, so this is taxpayer money. So there's several levels of to note. Number one, taxpayers' money. So it's one thing for kooky people to do kooky stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
But this is a lot of taxpayers' money, as you said, ostensibly, not just ostensibly, but explicitly marked for science. This is for science.
For science.
And so I think a lot of people would just say, well, that's just these, crazy academics or crazy this or crazy that. But it's taxpayer money. It's officially within the realm of science, meant to advance science. And so the logical, the happiest conclusion you might draw is, don't be alarmed. It's a hoax. right? In other words,
Yeah.
you would hope that it would be a hoax. But so you're saying that no, they looked into it, and not only was it not a hoax, they denied it, and they get a TED Talk trying to explain why this is something people should take seriously. But as you just said, you and Peter, thank the Lord, I just love this, is so delicious, got an idea.
Yeah.
Because you thought, oh, yes, what if someone were to write a paper like this, but as a hoax? That, when I first heard about this, it was so appealing to me. I was just tickled to death. I never thought I'd get to meet you. So keep going.
Yeah, so Peter and I decided to write a paper, one paper, and I don't know, by early 2017, so a few months after all of this, we finally come up with an idea and we've cobbled together. We get on the phone and have a hilarious conversation. Let's be real about how the funniest conversations. And so we come up with this idea that we should say, in homage to the menstrual blood as a social construct, we said, well, we should just say that the penis is a social construct. Doesn't really exist, causes all of our problems, and of course, especially climate change. So we write this paper as a proof of concept called the conceptual penis as a social construct. And we write the most gratuitous varsity blues, puerile nonsense about, all these metaphors to masculinity and rapacious against nature, all these just lewd references to the male organ, on and on, like children. We're having such a good time. 3,000 words, academic sounding language. Oh, it causes certain machismo in men, all this nonsense. And it, of course, causes climate change. And this we submit to a masculinities journal. I don't even know at the time what masculinity studies is, but it seems like
I never heard of masculinity studies.
This journal had already published some kind of postmodern exploration of the male organ, as we'll phrase it. And so we thought, well, it fits. We'll send it there. And this journal, as it turns out, was in the Taylor and Francis umbrella, so it's a large academic publisher. And they did not want the paper. They rejected the paper.
They rejected,
to their credit,
the hoax paper.
The hoax paper. So here we accidentally uncover a genuine academic scandal, which is the editor of that journal, which was called Norma, which is an abbreviation for something, an acronym for something, forgot what, North something, masculinity is the M. But at any rate, the editor sends us a letter. We are not interested in this paper. However, we have a sister journal that we would happily internally forward your paper to them, and we think they would be interested in. Now, I'd published a paper in mathematics. Peter had published a handful of papers. I've never heard of a journal forwarding a paper to another journal, but we said, okay, whatever. So they send it off to this journal called Cogent Social Sciences, which sounds a little lowbrow. And it turns out what it is under the same Taylor and Francis umbrella. It's a predatory journal, which means if you pay them, they'll publish whatever you send them. And the going rate, as it turns out, at that journal was $1,300 per paper. But it was on a half-off sale.
Now, hang on a second. This is really wild. Most of us who are not in the academy would assume that the point of peer-reviewed journals is objectivity, to maintain standards. So one journal rejects the paper, but then says, we'd like to forward it to a sister journal. So yes, that does seem curious. But then you bring up the second issue that they're saying, oh, and by the way, if you pay money, they may be willing to. I've heard about this. I can't remember where just recently somebody was talking about this. And you think, well, that's wild, because this is supposed to be objective. It's supposed to be about knowledge and the furtherance of truth or science or whatever it is. So you're saying that at that point you realized something strange is happening.
No, we were actually kind of monomaniacally focused on getting our paper accepted. Right. So we were excited that this goes off to another journal, very naive, thinking about how this might all work. But what we'd actually discovered was a Taylor and Francis, that's academic publisher, I guess legitimate in the broadest sense, journal, Norma, has now passed it off to one where if we pay Taylor and Francis money, they'll publish so we can pad our resume or whatever reason we might use to do that. So we send it to they send it off to this other journal. We don't know it's predatory at the time, but lo and behold, they accept the paper. No challenges through peer review, no problem. They want the paper. And then they forget to charge us and publish the paper. And then they send us an email the next day. We forgot to charge you. Will you please pay? And we said no. And we will not. And we come out with our expose. Gender studies.
Wait. When you say you come out with your expose, so you've published a fraudulent paper.
Yes.
And then you decide, after getting this one paper published, this utterly fraudulent hoax paper, you decide to reveal that it's a hoax and to call them on the carpet.
Correct. We were trying to make the point that the academic enterprise called gender studies itself is fraudulent, because it would accept a paper like this, and then we could compare against other papers and say, well, obviously what they're doing is not objective. It's also not even legitimately academic. It's just, politically driven nonsense.
Yeah.
That was the intention. Well, because this journal will accept anything for money, we didn't, in fact, prove our point, and we got called on it. And so a couple of people, including the legendary Alan Sokal, who in the 1990s wrote an academic hoax of the Duke University Press journal called Social Text, which was on something about the hermeneutic of quantum gravity nonsense. He wrote this nonsense social sciences paper about how everything's oppressive or whatever regarding gravity. And I think it was, in fact, that gravity is a social construct and doesn't really exist.
Yeah.
Quite funny. Alan Sokal lives here in London, actually. He's a wonderful man. He's a physicist and a mathematician, brilliant man. And we were kind of walking in his very big shoes. So Alan Sokal writes a very thoughtful article about what he thought we demonstrated and didn't demonstrate. And he concludes, well, it's definitely making a point by parody, but at the same point, at the same time, did they prove their point about the field of gender studies? And he said yes and no, but mostly no. Had they wished to prove their point, they would have done A, B, C, and D, which were things like higher ranking journals, more papers, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay, so in other words, if you really wanted to blow this whole thing open and show the corruption that has entered the academy, he's saying you should do it this way. So more papers, higher level journals. So, but I guess by now, were you not outed? Did people not? In other words, keep going.
Yeah. Well, it turns out, we wrote that under fake names. We could make up more fake names.
Aha.
Yeah.
If you're gonna perpetuate if you're gonna put forward a hoax, use fake names. All right, please continue.
So Peter and I took this criticism, to heart, and we said they have a point. In fact, it's some of our actual critics, Alan being kind of, very generous and charitable with his analysis, and then some people who were very not charitable, writing for leftist magazines, came out and said actually the same things if they wished to prove their point, and it was the same list of things to do. Peter and I got on the phone and said, well, why don't we do those? Let's set aside some time and let's write as many academic papers for maybe a year as we can write, and send them off to the highest ranking journals that we can get them in. And if the big journal doesn't take it, we make lists. We just go right down the list for each subdiscipline. So if we're in gender studies, it's this journal, and that journal's the next best one. And then we just go down the list till one of them takes it. And Peter was betting that if we wrote enough papers, we could probably get 2 or 3 accepted in a year to a year and a half's time. And I was convinced we could get 0, that I didn't think academia was so broken that it would take any of these things. So we recruit our friend Helen Pluckrose to help us, because she already kind of speaks leftist academic from her master's thesis she had to write. And we knew that about her. And she had defended our attempt on the first paper. And so we set off for a year and wrote 20 academic articles. Now, a lot of people don't understand it. An academic article, usually a productive academic writes 1 or 2 per year. They're a major production. We wrote 20. We were run every 2 weeks, actually, for just over a year.
Now, can you share some of the titles of some of these hoax papers?
Some of them are a little adult. I don't know what
don't share the
G rating
the
is.
extremely adult ones, but
But they do have funny titles. We were the most famous of the papers that we wrote bore a title. Let me see if I can even do this from memory. It was something like Queer Performativity and Rape Culture in Urban Dog Parks in Portland, Oregon. So we claimed...
No. This is too much. Do one more time, because this is...
Queer Performativity and rape culture in urban dog parks in Portland, Oregon.
In urban dog parks
Yes.
in Portland, Oregon.
Yeah. So the idea was, we thought it'd be funny to write a paper from a feminist perspective saying that what would solve the problem of men in society is if we trained men the way we train dogs. And then Peter had some dogs, and he lived in Portland, and he took his dogs to the dog park. I said, well, just sprinkle some stuff in from your experiences at the dog park to make it more believable and funny. And so Pete writes this completely mad paper. It's just positively insane. And what he comes up with is this idea that, well, we can assess how supportive of rape culture, as the feminists put it, that people think rape must be okay somehow, how supportive men are, or people are, by how they react to seeing dogs interact in that sexual way at the dog park. So we made up a bunch of fake stories about men, straight men who were like, get her, boy, they were into it. And then the women were horrified, oh, don't do that, and the gay men were, oh, don't do that.
It's even interesting to me that in an academic paper relating, again, you're making this up, but relating anecdotes like this as some kind of evidence, that's it's at least interesting.
Absolutely.
that would be acceptable.
And so, so this paper was completely absurd.
Yeah.
And it not only was accepted by the leading feminist geography journal, it was published by that journal, it was also given a recognition for excellence in scholarship in the discipline of feminist geography by that journal.
Okay, we don't have a snare drum in the studio, but wow. Any other papers that you remember the titles of?
Well, we gave a lot of them kind of cute, cheeky titles where the title is something and then the subtitle is long and complicated academic stuff that tells you what it's really about. But we had a paper where we said that straight men would be less transphobic if they practiced putting things somewhere. And I'm assuming you can guess where.
You're really, it's amazing. So you wrote these as academic papers.
The title we gave that paper was Going In Through the Back Door.
All right. So you wrote, how many papers did you write, and how many were accepted?
We wrote 20.
Yeah.
7 of them had been accepted. 4 of them had actually been published. There's quite a time delay between acceptance and publication in academic publishing frequently.
Yeah.
4 had actually been published. The 1 had gotten an award. Of the 20, 7 further of the papers were still under peer review. And a sociologist not related to us did a post-mortem on our project after this came out. It turns out the Wall Street Journal figured out, because this dog paper was so insane that journalists wouldn't leave it alone. A college student figured out this can't be real, whereas the academics could not figure out that this can't be real. So this college student, just a college journalist working for Campus Reform or some small, publication of this sort, just wouldn't leave it alone. And finally, this builds up enough weight of what's going on questions to where the Wall Street Journal got involved. They started asking much too hard of questions, and we decided this is all coming out. We have to come clean. So we had 7 of our papers still under review, and the sociologist concludes that it would have either been 11 or 12 out of the 20 that had been accepted, but 7 had been. And there was an 8th that, just by the way that the peer reviewers' comments and editors' comments came back, we were certain was any day now, would have been added to the list. But yeah, 7 had been accepted.
Okay, so one would expect that this would blow up, and that the whole academic world would be red-faced, humiliated, and that there would have been some kind of reckoning as a result.
Yeah, that's not what happened. They said that we were mean and that we took advantage of the good faith aspect of academic publishing, that you can trust that when somebody submits something that they meant what they submitted, that they wouldn't do something so underhanded as to submit a paper in bad faith, as we had done. And they otherwise ignored it. They pretended it just didn't happen and waited for the scandal to blow over and go away. Except at Portland State University, where Peter worked, they brought him up on various ethics charges with the university and harangued him. One of his accusations, so one of our papers, we actually took the 12th chapter of Hitler's Mein Kampf, and it's about how to build our movement. So we throw out our movement, we throw in intersectional feminism, we rewrite it as a feminist screed. a feminist social work journal accepted that paper.
Wait, using Mein Kampf's chapter 12 as a template.
Yes.
In
The
other
title of
words,
that was Our Struggle is My Struggle.
really, there's almost nothing to say. It's so unbelievable. So
But I bring that
you
up
did this,
because
yeah.
one of the
yeah.
ethics charges against Peter was plagiarism. And
Plagiarizing Hitler.
they said you plagiarized Hitler. And to that, you know, he has these 3 charges or whatever they've levied against him, ethics charges. And to that one, he immediately pleads guilty. Yes, I plagiarized Hitler. That was the point. And they immediately withdraw the charge because they didn't want to admit that it was, in fact, Mein Kampf that they had published in a significantly actually rewritten form to hide it from the plagiarism detectors and whatever.
Well,
else.
I mean, to get to the larger issue of whether the West is in decline or whether there seems little question that what you're describing is at the heart of the decline of the West, because the academy is always in the forefront of things that decades later kind of trickle down in other ways.
So the peer-reviewed academic literature, for good or for ill, represents that which our society at the highest level of this activity authenticates as what will act as though is true. So, for example, should some issue go to court, the judge is going to bring in, he's a judge, he's busy doing law things, right? So say it's a medical issue about transition or something. What are they going to do? They're going to bring in expert witnesses who are going to report on what the academic literature says. And so some person is going to get hired by, you know, the attorneys and is going to come in and say, well, there's all these papers that say that if you put things somewhere, then, you know, you can, whatever. So we use this as the authenticating piece of what is true in our society. Now, as for the theme of the decline of the West, if the centerpiece of how you decide what is and is not going to be regarded as true is this corrupt, there will be decline. This is inevitable. The rot is so in such a dangerous place, in such a significant place, that the only really real metaphor to it is that there's the well that everyone will now drink from has a dead body in it. And it's only a matter of time till everybody's sick and dying as a result.
The fact that you did this, you know, I think gives some people hope. And one would hope that it would cause some people to do something about it. But it seems like that's not the case. In other words, it seems like in the world, some things are so far gone, maybe there's no helping them.
I don't know. So we're at this conference here in London, and there are thousands of people here from all over the world, including many from Europe. I think, you know, probably a couple thousand people here are from Europe and or the UK. And I've been approached by dozens, if not 100 people who have had the same message, that those papers that we wrote, and this all came out in 2018, that those papers that we wrote and published 6-7 years ago, and I heard this morning, as a matter of fact, from 2 guys from the Netherlands, said that these papers that we published have significant implications for Europe today, with thanks that we did it. So it did not immediately have an effect, but the fact of us having done that cannot go away. It happened. And as people have finally started to realize, I think in the intervening half decade or a little over half decade, that something has gone badly wrong, and they're looking for the causes and the sources, there is this monument that we, in a sense, erected that says, here lies a problem. And people are starting to turn to it. And I've heard phrasing like, it got called in the wake of everything, it ended up being named, according to Wikipedia, it's called the Grievance Studies Affair. And so I've heard people say that the Grievance Studies Affair has never been more relevant, especially as Claudine Gay's plagiarism scandal broke, and then we start to see plagiarism rampantly throughout the DEI-related literature in higher education.
Yeah, Claudine Gay, the former president of Harvard University, clearly caught plagiarizing really dramatically, not a little bit. And this is not an academic. This is the president of Harvard University. So yeah, the rot goes very, very deep. So deep down that it's right at the top.
Yeah, and so we've, like I said, what this amounts to at this point is that it's a very bright sign, maybe with neon lights if they can be turned on at some point, pointing that the corruption that it doesn't matter the issue. Is it this race and gender identity stuff that's everywhere? Is it climate change? Can we trust the academic canon upon which we've been making these decisions? When these guys go out at a big European forum or the Davos forum or the UN or whatever, and they trot out, well, studies show that blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
We have, because of this sign that Peter and I and Helen stuck in the ground, we have to at some point start to realize we have a question here. Can we trust what those studies said, given that they've published this asinine paper about dogs?
You've built. You've accomplished. Yet you know, deep down, that no matter how much you've gained, there's no greater reward than the joy of giving. You understand that true fulfillment lies not in what you've amassed, but in how you can use it to make a difference. For over 40 years, WaterStone has turned your success into a lasting impact. Together, we are transforming charitable assets like real estate, business interests, and appreciated securities into resources that advance God's kingdom. With our experienced team and tailored strategies, we make generosity simple, so your giving can continue to grow and reach those that need it most. Experience the true reward of your success. Start your giving journey with WaterStone.
It seems, and I don't know if this is what you talk about in your book, Cynical Theories, but it seems that critical theory, Marxist theory, the grievance studies. I remember Harold Bloom calling it that in the 80s when I was at Yale. I mean, the grievance studies that even people like Harold Bloom were just thinking, this is a bad turn that we've taken here. What's happened? But it seems, all of it seems to be corrosive, and it seems to be corrosive of what we could call Western values. It seems to be, in fact, very hostile to Western values. So the question is that intentional? Maybe let's try to talk about, where does all this come from? In other words, how do you get to a place in the early 21st century where this kind of thing is happening, where you have the president of Harvard University plagiarizing, where you have academic standards going through the floor? What led to this? And I know you've written about this and talked about it. So what are the things that got us here?
Well, I mean, certainly there's kind of very prosaic issues we can talk about, like the careerism in academia, the fact that the mechanism of careerism in academia increasingly became something they call publish or perish.
Right.
So if you want to have an academic career, what are you going to do? You got to publish a lot of papers. What's the easiest way to publish a lot of papers? Well, apparently we proved make them up. It's a very fast, very easy way. So within the social sciences, at least, particularly, you can just run with these things. But now we've seen other corruptions as well. We've seen people, for example, within the climate science domain come out and say, if you come up with an inconvenient conclusion, your paper cannot be published. Meanwhile, on the other hand, we see that the science of glaciology, in order to solve the problem of climate change, has to admit feminist art, had a National Science Foundation grant. So there's these other corruptions, ideological corruptions. And I think those are more interesting than the prosaic careerism that also enabled this to take place.
Well, it's always many things. I mean, my only field of semi-expertise is, Nazi Germany. What happened in the 30s? And you have, for evil to prevail, you have to have a combination of things. And one of those is greed. One of those is cowardice. One of those is, when you mention that the people reading the papers or the people in power, they like certain things and they don't like certain things, and you have to play to that. And of course, what that leads to is ideology. In other words, if you were publishing a paper in Germany in the late 30s that is positive toward the Jews, it won't get published. If you're writing a book about that, Bonhoeffer experienced this. He wrote a book, the prayer book of the Bible, about the Psalms. Well, you can't write about the Old Testament if the Jews are being demonized in a culture. So they start coming up with, Nordic racial theory, really crackpot stuff. But and of course, at some point, I guess this is where I'm going with this. At some point, it breaks down. You can kind of carry. You can. Speaking of hoaxes, it's like a hoax. You can move it forward for a while, but then eventually reality catches up with it.
Yeah, right.
And so what we're talking about here, it's something like that. It's like a bubble, and it goes and goes, and at some point, it won't work. But I still want to kind of go back to when did this start that you think? I mean, I know there's no right answer.
The
but,
Garden of Eden.
well, correct.
At one
I know.
point,
yeah.
I mean that both,
But in the West,
literally and metaphorically.
In the West, I would guess
Yeah.
that in the 1950s, let's say,
Yes.
science was science, math was math. People were doing their best. There's always going to be
Yes.
attending factors and qualifying aspects, but basically there was some kind of a dedication to
Correct.
some basics. At what point does this erode? Why does it begin to erode?
Like you said, there's many factors, I think, but the 1950s bleeding into the 1960s, I think, is a relevant point. So the critical theorists, who are these German Marxists who came over to the United States because their family heritage was Jewish, so they had to get out while the getting was good in the early 1930s, and they set themselves up at first Columbia University, then Brandeis University, and then the elite universities.
And the big names are what? Marcuse?
Herbert Marcuse in particular is what I'm thinking of. But Max Horkheimer, although he went back to Germany after the war, Theodor Adorno. But Herbert Marcuse is our, I think, star of the show here. But these critical theorists start to say what you said, sort of, but with their weird critical theory, cynical, paranoid Marxist twist, which, as you said, in the 1950s, science was science, math was math. And then they added in, because the people who want you to think that's science said that's science. And the people who want you to think that's what's math want you to think that's math. And there's a second, as Herbert Marcuse put it, he wrote a famous book in 1964 called One-Dimensional Man, How Capitalism Makes People One-Dimensional in Their Analysis. Everything's on the capitalist treadmill, whether you're working to earn money, to buy consumer goods so that you can have a fake consumer marketed life that you think is a meaningful. Everything's one-dimensional, boiled down to capitalism, but there's a deeper analysis, a critical analysis that says maybe it was all rigged to be this way. So maybe these scientific disciplines, in particular the social sciences that they were interested in, psychology, sociology, anthropology, are telling us a false story of who we are and how the world actually works. Maybe right-wingers, as Theodor Adorno wrote, are actually intrinsically authoritarian, so we need to exclude right-wingers from power. That's the thesis of the authoritarian personality.
It seems, and correct me if I'm going off here, but it seems like where they're coming from, ultimately, these, I guess today we'd say cultural Marxists, where they're coming from is, and I don't know if this is where the title of your book, Cynical Theories, comes from, but they seem to be fundamentally cynical about truth itself.
Yes.
That they're saying that there is no such thing actually as truth. There's just people with points of view, and those who have the most power can impose that on others. But they're stating that as a fact. They're not stating this as a mitigating factor.
With no sense of irony.
They're saying this is, well, yes. So they're making this statement, and it's not like they don't have a point. I mean, you can have a point, but they take it to a place that seems really corrosive.
Right. So the postmodernists, specifically the French postmodernists, explicitly had the view that you just articulated, that there is no truth actually at all. Everything we think is true is a manifestation of power. The critical theorists had a much more dismal view, in my opinion. A lot of people credit the postmodernists as being the most nihilistic, everything's rotten, everything's power, nothing's real. The critical theorists, I think, had a much more dismal view. There is a truth. It's a liberated truth. We just don't know what it is. We can only approach it in the negative. Like some theologies only try to define what God is not, what's an inadequate definition of God. Well, their definition is there's an ideal society, but we can't express it. So every articulation of what society is somehow falls short of what society should be. Or in the modern left woke parlance, everything's problematic. So everything, if we boil that down into the dimension of race, you end up with the sky is racist, going for a walk is racist, the river is racist, everything's race, everything. somehow has the problematic of racism in it. Why? Because society is not ideal. Therefore, we know, since we've not achieved the Platonic ideal of an anti-racist society, where there must be racism somewhere causing things, and all that they know how to how to do in this negative way is to say, here's a place society's not living up to the ideal. Here's another place. And then this becomes a credentialing mechanism in those academic fields. So that publisher parish model, which also emerges in the 50s and 60s, Robert Maxwell was instrumental in helping to develop that being a credentialing model for, he was a book publisher, an academic book publisher. So he comes up with this business scheme for how do you get these academic journals to make money, and how do you get school libraries to buy them, and how do you make big subscriptions of them and all this stuff. And this actually becomes the birthplace of the publisher parish model, because you need people reading the journals, you need people publishing in the journals, and what if you can make it that a career contingency? So you go lobby other academic departments at the universities and say, oh, well, a great way to know who should be a tenured faculty member is how many papers did they publish in the last 7 years? And in what journals were they in? And what journals have standing? So this whole infrastructure emerges at the same time as this ability to write, that's a problem, that's a problem, that's a problem, that's a problem, because everything's not this they call it liberated at this point, but not, it's Marxist. This Marxist ideal of actual, as the Soviets use the term, actual equality, where there's economic equality, social equality, cultural equality, absolute equality across all individuals in all domains alike.
In one of your books titled The Marxification of Education, you talk obviously about what we're talking about here. You've also written a book called The Queering of the American Child, and then Cynical Theories. These things are related.
Yes.
This is what I find interesting about you, is that you help us understand how critical theory, critical race theory, cultural Marxism, and then LGBTQ ideology, how they're related. For somebody who doesn't understand any of that, can you lay out a little bit the relationship between these things? Because these are trends. We see them in culture. We certainly see them in the academy, but how are they related? How do they relate to each other?
So we've already named the star of this show, I think, relevant to the American context at least, which is Herbert Marcuse, this arch critical theorist, one-dimensional man, and so on, that he wrote in the 60s. So Herbert Marcuse, in One-Dimensional Man, and then in his subsequent, kind of heavyweight essay that he writes in 1969 called An Essay on Liberation, explains that basically in America, what he calls advanced capitalism, you're not going to be able to motivate the working class to be a proletariat that will overthrow and seize the means of production and bring us into the Marxist utopia.
Right.
But he says there is the possibility for a better society that we've all given up on, meaning the Marxists are all very negative now. It's not going to work.
Right.
The collapse of the Soviet Union actually the crimes of Stalin have been confessed, is where we are historically. Oh my gosh, how horrible was what was going on there. And so they're all in this dismal state. We've got to rethink things. And so he says, we need a different proletariat. And what he says is, well, what we can do is we can bring this two-dimensional or critical analysis to the college students.
Okay, hang on. So it's the 60s that this happens.
This is the 60s.
And Marcuse, if I just want to make sure I'm understanding this, so he basically says classic economic Marxism, it's not looking good.
Not in the
and
US.
It doesn't look like we can, if your goal is to make the United States communist, which of course it was the goal of world communism to do that, it doesn't look like it's working. But he's saying, wait a minute, I've got another idea about how to take the idea behind Marxism, not necessarily economic, but a previous idea, and we can use that. So what is that previous idea? Is it the idea of pitting one group against the other, we're not going to pit the workers against the
management or bosses or owners.
That won't work, but we've got another idea, same concept. We're going to pit this group against that group, this group against that group.
Which, by the way, is the very opening, it's got an artistic preamble, but when you get past the preamble and get to the first chapter, it's only a 2-chapter document, the Communist Manifesto. The first paragraph of the first chapter, Karl Marx says that all of the history of man is the history of the conflict between classes. And he lists a bunch of different classes. And then he says, and in a word, that means oppressor versus oppressed. So that's the fundamental idea. We're going to do this oppressor versus oppressed. But even Marx in the Communist Manifesto, 1848, is admitting there are different ways the class structure to society can come out. Well, here's Marcuse saying we're not going to get it economically, a little over a century later. We're not going to get it economically. And what can we do? And he says, he says there's the people who understand the theory. We can get them in the colleges. And then there are the people who have what he calls the vital energy for revolution. And who are they? He calls them the ghetto populations, racial minorities, especially the black populations, in the literal what they called ghetto by that point.
Yeah.
But ghetto still had its kind of older meaning, like cordoned off, outsiders. Right. And so the sexual minorities, the feminists, he's naming these people, the mentally ill, the prisoners, he's naming these groups explicitly. They have common cause and a vital energy to overthrow a society that's not working for them. They can be led to become a new proletariat if only we could get them to understand the problems that they have in life and the oppressor-oppressed dynamic that we can give to the college students.
So Marcuse sees all this in the 60s. He comes up with this idea. It's a brilliant, diabolical idea, but it originates with him.
Well, he probably borrowed it from Mao Zedong, actually. He probably borrowed it. By this point, we're in the 60s. The Cultural Revolution's been raging in China. Mao had been brought back to power, his full power, through the Cultural Revolution. And that actually turned out to be an identity politics game, primarily, that Mao played. We're going to classify people as either red class or black class. We're going to pit them against each other in different categories. And Marcuse speaks glowingly of the revolution taking place, the Cultural Revolution taking place in China. He probably borrowed the idea, imported it, and put it on the ghetto populations, the outsider populations of the United States as his he calls it literally the new working class or the new proletariat. And so he says this. So now you see that this whole identity politics constellation that we call intersectionality is going to come downstream. Eventually, the black feminist, that's literally a school of thought that combines black liberationism and feminism in the sexual minority, sexual liberation. Eventually, this is all going to fuse into some melting pot of Marxist disaster.
Right.
And then secondly, a few years later, after the riots of the 60s don't work, he writes in Counter-Revolution and Revolt, we have to go into the different professions. We have to go into, especially education at all levels, to start transforming the youth to understand a critical consciousness of reality. And that's how we get to the Marxification of education.
Well,
they had to change the youth.
What's so fascinating to me, and I know a lot of this stuff, but as you talk about it, the intentionality, in other words, it's not like, well, this stuff happened. It was planned. That's what's so hard to take in, that there were people who were hardcore ideologues, activists who wanted to make this happen and had a very fertile environment because, of course, the academy has tended radically left for some time. I guess we could even ask, when did that start? Does that start with John Dewey? I don't know.
I mean, he's an education reformer. I don't know that he's responsible for the academy tending left. I think that also started primarily in the 60s. I mean, I'm not entirely certain of that.
No, I mean, I can tell you, William F. Buckley writes his book, God and Man at Yale, in about, I think, 1951. He's criticizing Yale of the 40s as being, the faculty as being communist and atheist. And I think you can trace it way back before that. But it's kind of like a trickle-down theory.
Probably then as soon as they stop being seminaries.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's just interesting. But in any event, so we're talking about where we are now, and you're saying that this catches on, and here we are. I mean, I remember already in the 80s at Yale when I was there, critical theory and Derrida was held up. I mean, this was already had completely taken over the humanities in the early 80s.
Yeah. Well, think about the spirit of the 60s, right?
Yeah.
You were one-dimensional, you were square, you were boring unless you were doing all this. They didn't use the word woke back then, but if you were doing all this critical analysis that was in such high fashion, especially in these academic corners, you were hip. That was the word they used, in fact. Hipsters are downstream from this, in fact. So you've got this this kind of frisson, or this cachet of cool moving in a particular direction within academic circles. Oh, Eric, you just think math is math. There's a whole other dimension you don't understand. You are square, you're boring,
Yeah.
you're so quotidian,
Yeah.
And so there's this kind of like weird academic arrogance layer where these people peddling critical theory at
Right.
first that eventually became postmodern and just artsy fartsy and stupid. I mean, literally just stupid.
Yeah.
Had an academic credential or status given to them that they didn't deserve. Now, you combine this with the fact, again, I come back to our fake papers. We wrote 20 of these. I could not write 20 math papers in a year. I could not write 20 physics papers in a year.
That's kind of the point. Is
You
that the
could write
humanities are it's such a dramatically different standard.
If you do
because-
2 years of reading so
Yeah.
that you have the citations kind of lined up
Yeah.
in a particular domain, you can make papers in the critical domains as fast as you can write. So dozens of them is possible in a short period of time. You can flood the zone
Yeah.
with nonsense. Add in that those are the people who get to go to the pinkies up champagne parties, and all of this. And you kind of have this recipe. They have the publisher parish advantage because they can publish very quickly. It appears that they're doing academic work. Nobody knows what they're talking about because, in fact, what they're talking about is nonsense, but they are PhDs, so they must mean something, right? So they've got this air that they're not just smart, they're so smart nobody knows what they're talking about. Whoa, they're really smart. You put all these things together and it's almost a perfect storm. It's like you said, many ingredients allowed the Nazis to rise. Many ingredients allowed academia to completely pervert itself. Later, eventually, they go gangbusters on student services, new dorms, building fitness centers and all this. They've all become financially beholden. So now what? Well, you got to keep the kids coming. You got to lower the standards. You got to keep them happy. All of this. And then what happens if you have, say, 2% of your students are radical activists who everything's, sexist and I can't stand it? Well, you can't lose those 2%. So you better bend administrative policy to make those 2% happy so they don't go away. So later structural forces come in by the 90s and early 2000s that just accelerate this problem until finally, I think maybe with the publication of the Glacier paper, I don't know, the whole thing, the bubble pops, the whole thing throws over. And now we're looking at, academia in kind of tatters.
Well, see, that I said that is the question that I want to ask now. What are we looking at? Because, we're asking whether the West has a future. It's interesting because if you think about, you talk about the rise of the Nazis, you talk about, Soviet communism. Eventually, it took 70 years for Soviet communism, but eventually they run out of other people's money. It breaks down. Eventually, the Nazis, that's not as good an example, but evil keeps taking different forms. The demons look for different hosts.
Yeah.
And in this case, I think that is the question. Where do you think we are? Because in 89 and 91, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Berlin Wall comes down. Everybody's thrilled, naively not realizing that as much as standard, economic Marxism has fallen apart, it's gone underground, and it is, like a fire, an underground fire moving through the institutions. And so today, with, you say the academy is in tatters. Is it really? I hope it is. I hope that there's a reckoning. But what is your sense, given what we've been talking about?
So I think that this is a very interesting question at a very interesting moment. And normally you don't have the opportunity to say that. These are big truths that we're talking about, big things. And the analogy to the Berlin Wall coming down and the fall of Soviet communism are also very poignant because you said we all believed we're at this turning point in history, and then we have to now reckon 30 years later with, were we really? So I think we're in the exact same kind of moment again. Had you asked me this question, say in October, which is just a few months ago, I would have had to answer it, maybe cautiously optimistically, but somewhat differently. But after the election of Donald Trump, and this isn't to make this about Trump or Trumpy kind of, or MAGA or whatever. After the election of Donald Trump, we have to admit that we are now in a moment. The election of Donald Trump is in a way, not to draw the parallel literally, in a way tantamount to a Berlin Wall falling. We're in now a completely different era. It doesn't matter if you like Trump or not. What you have to say is true about the election of Donald Trump in 2024 is that people have looked around at their society, not just in the United States, but meaningfully here in the United States, and said, what we are doing isn't working. You don't have to like Donald. Donald Trump is irrelevant to this. He might even actually be in the opposite direction, more relevant to this story, in the sense that a lot of people have this visceral reaction against, like an allergic reaction against Donald Trump. A lot of Democrats have been absolutely, he is the worst of the worst. If they'd run any other person, maybe I'd consider, but not Donald Trump. Oh my gosh, TDS, Trump derangement, they call this syndrome. Trump says that it rots the mind first and then rots the body. He's a funny man, but it's not about this. You have that being overcome by Democrats, not all of them, obviously, but millions of Democrats in the United States said, what we're doing is failing so badly, I'm willing to risk Donald Trump.
So that, I guess that brings us to the larger question, is that if things are falling apart spectacularly, if things are manifestly not working, that's good, because then people wake up.
That's exactly right.
And so what we're talking about now is that so many things have gone so far in a certain direction that many people who were blithely drifting along said, wait a minute, this is bad, we need a change. And politics is only one example of this. But so for me, that, to bring it back to the question of the academy, the world of higher education, it seems so entrenched that even with all we're talking about, maybe it's, is it the market forces that will save us, that parents won't send their kids to crazy, elite institutions because they now know that those degrees aren't worth what they were worth 10 or 20 or 50 years ago?
Some of that, I think, will play a role. It's hard to tell what the mechanisms specifically will be. But what we are in is undeniably, what we're in now is a moment in which a very large number of people across a very broad segment of the political spectra are saying, what we've been doing isn't working. We need to find something else that will. Now, this is a dangerous moment as well, because there are good solutions that can enter into a space like that, and there are very bad solutions. Adolf Hitler famously said, Weimar is not working. We need to make Germany great again. And lots of young Germans were like, yes, we do. And that wasn't such a good solution. In fact, it's one of the greatest, and not to diminish anything, but one of the greatest cautionary tales about how to pick the wrong solution to a problem that history has furnished us. And so we're in this kind of a moment, frankly, again, Weimar America has not been working. We're making America great again. But the question is, are we going to do this by legitimate means, or are we going to fall prey to the easy promises of a demagogue? And I think that this is so I can't tell you the mechanisms. I don't know if it's going to, market forces will do it. This is too granular for a moment of this, of this magnitude. We're now in a space where something has to change. I would say at least plurality, if not a majority of people recognize something has to change. We've got to find solutions. We have to figure out how to credential people to be professionals. This is a problem that demands a solution. Necessity always is the mother of invention. So solutions that may not look anything like what we've had before will come along. Well, one thing we do know from, say, Germany in the 1930s is some new ideological programs, probably not, all the people who believe this are the ones who we should credential. That's probably, the ones who have the German science. That's maybe not the right answer.
Right.
But what is the right answer? How do we know who's good to be this kind of professional? This is a problem that necessity has thrust upon us. And we have at least the warning signs that were not given to the Germans in the 1930s of some very wrong answers and what can happen when you take them. And hopefully we have both the capacity to speak into this space, to push or nudge the issue into better directions rather than worse, so that good solutions can emerge. But I think there's as much danger as there is in this moment. Drawing parallels to the rise of the Nazis indicates that I think there's great danger in this moment. There's also unbelievable hope, probably in similar measure, and I mean genuine hope, not the false hope of exciting demagogue.
Yeah.
To figure out how to navigate the challenges of a world that's technologically completely different from
Right.
what it was 70 years ago or 50 years ago. And yet that is, as I think you would greatly appreciate and do greatly appreciate, is waking up very quickly to, we better figure out how timeless truths apply to these problems, because these expedient solutions, whether we talk about the expedience of the demagogue of Hitler, or we talk about the expedience of the careerism of the academy, those aren't good answers.
Wow. Well, I think we'll have to leave it there. But Dr. James Lindsay, really very grateful for you and for your time today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eric.